This is the best I can do.
You look like you're drawing a mountain with your signature like this. Who would dare approve it?
Bank employee laughed at disabled vet's signature. 5 minutes later, armed escorts walked in with the CEO. The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of First National Bank as 78-year-old Arthur Hayes shuffled through the heavy glass doors, his worn canvas satchel clutched tightly in his weathered hands. His slight limp, a souvenir from a mortar blast in Vietnam 50 years ago, made each step deliberate and careful as he approached the marble counter that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Arthur's faded blue eyes, once sharp enough to spot enemy movement through jungle foliage, now struggled to focus on the maze of signs and cue markers that directed customers through the modern banking maze. His face, etched with lines that told the story of a life lived intensely, bore the quiet dignity of a man who had seen too much, but complained too little. The bank's opulent interior, polished marble floors, gleaming brass fixtures, and imposing columns stood in stark contrast to Arthur's humble appearance. His clothes, though meticulously clean, were threadbare from years of careful use. The disability pension that brought him here each month was barely enough to cover his modest needs, but it was all he had after a lifetime of service to his country. Behind the teller window, 19-year-old Brad Morrison adjusted his crisp uniform and polished his already gleaming nameplate. Fresh out of high school and barely 3 months into his first real job, Brad carried himself with the arrogance of youth and the superficial confidence of someone who had never faced real hardship. His polished shoes and perfectly pressed shirt marked him as someone who judged others by their appearance and found most people wanting. Brad watched Arthur approach with barely concealed disdain. To him, the elderly veteran represented everything distasteful about the bank's clientele, the pension recipients, disability claimants, and other undesirable customers who cluttered up what should have been a prestigious financial institution serving only the wealthy and successful. Next, Brad called out, with theatrical impatience, though Arthur was the only customer in line. Arthur approached the window slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he reached into his satchel for his withdrawal slip and identification. The tremor in his hands, caused by nerve damage from his war injuries, made even simple tasks like writing a challenge that required patience and understanding. "I'd like to withdraw from my pension account, please," Arthur said quietly, his voice carrying the respectful tone of a man who had been taught to treat all people with dignity, regardless of how they treated him in return. What Arthur didn't know was that this routine transaction was about to become anything but routine setting. In motion, a chain of events that would expose both the worst and best of human nature. Brad took Arthur's withdrawal slip with an exaggerated sigh, his eyes immediately focusing on the signature line where Arthur's shaking hand had produced a barely legible scrawl. The tremor that made Arthur's handwriting difficult was the result of nerve damage from shrapnel wounds. But to Brad, it simply looked like the incompetent scribbling of a confused old man. "What is this supposed to be?" Brad asked loudly, holding up the slip so that other bank employees and the few customers in the lobby could see. "I can't even read this signature. It looks like a child wrote it." Arthur felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment as heads turned in his direction. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I have some nerve damage in my hands from an old injury. Sometimes my writing isn't as clear as it used to be." Brad rolled his eyes dramatically. "Sir, we have standards here." This is a bank, not a charity. If you can't write your own name legibly, maybe you should have someone else handle your banking." The words hit Arthur like physical blows. He had commanded a platoon of Marines in some of the fiercest fighting of the Vietnam War, had been decorated for valor under fire, and had spent 40 years after his service working construction to support himself and help other veterans. But now, in this marble palace of finance, he was being treated like an incompetent burden. "Could I perhaps try again?" Arthur asked, his voice maintaining its quiet dignity despite the humiliation. "Sometimes, if I take my time." "Rules are rules," Brad interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. "Standard procedure requires a legible signature. I can't process a transaction with chicken scratch like this." Arthur's knuckles turned white as he gripped the pen, fighting against the tremor that had been his constant companion since a piece of North Vietnamese shrapnel had severed nerves in his right arm. He had learned to adapt to many challenges over the years, but the simple act of signing his name in public had become a source of anxiety and shame. As Arthur struggled to control his shaking hand, Brad made a show of checking his watch and tapping his fingers impatiently on the counter. "Sir, there are other customers waiting. If you can't complete this simple task, perhaps you should come back when you're feeling more capable." The other customers in line began to murmur among themselves, some checking their phones, others shifting impatiently. Arthur could feel their eyes on him, could sense their growing irritation at the delay he was causing. The weight of their judgment pressed down on him like the humid heat of the Vietnamese jungle he had once fought through. Arthur's second attempt at signing his name was even worse than the first. His hand, now shaking from both nerve damage and anxiety, produced a signature that was barely recognizable as letters, much less as his name. "This is ridiculous," Brad announced to the lobby. "I'm going to have to call a manager. We can't process transactions with signatures like this." As Brad picked up his phone to summon help, Arthur stood quietly at the counter, his worn satchel clutched against his chest like a shield. He thought about the young Marines he had once led, boys who had looked to him for strength and leadership in the face of enemy fire. Those same hands that now shook with nerve damage had once steadied rifles, thrown grenades, and carried wounded soldiers to safety. But that was a lifetime ago, and this was now. In this gleaming temple of commerce, Arthur Hayes was just another inconvenient old man whose disability made him an embarrassment to the institution's polished image. Ms. Patricia Davis, the branch manager, emerged from her office with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to solving problems quickly and moving on to more important matters. At 38, she had climbed the corporate ladder through a combination of competence and an unwavering adherence to rules and procedures. Her impeccably tailored suit and perfectly arranged hair projected the image of professional authority that the bank valued in its management staff. "What seems to be the problem here?" Ms. Davis asked, her tone polite but cool as she approached Brad's window. "This gentleman can't provide a legible signature," Brad explained, holding up Arthur's withdrawal slip like evidence in a criminal trial. "I've explained our policies, but he keeps insisting we process this transaction anyway." Ms. Davis examined the slip with the same dismissive expression that Brad had worn. "Sir, I understand this may be frustrating, but we have security protocols that must be followed. A signature this illegible could be a sign of fraud or forgery." Arthur looked up at her with tired eyes. "Ma'am, I have nerve damage from my military service. My hands shake, but I can provide additional identification if needed. I just need to withdraw money from my pension account." "Military service," Ms. Davis repeated, her tone suggesting that she'd heard this excuse before. "Sir, regardless of your personal circumstances, bank policy is clear. We cannot process transactions without proper identification verification." It was then that Ms. Davis noticed something that made her pause. The account number on Arthur's withdrawal slip seemed familiar, and as she looked more closely, her expression changed from dismissive to alarmed. "Brad," she said quietly, "what account is this withdrawal from?" Brad checked his computer screen. "It's listed under the Worthington Endowment Trust, but he says it's just his pension account." Ms. Davis felt the blood drain from her face. The Worthington Endowment Trust was one of the bank's most significant accounts, a multi-million-dollar fund that had been established decades ago and was managed at the highest levels of the corporation. The idea that this shabby old man was attempting to access it seemed impossible. "Sir, Ms. Davis," said her voice taking on a sharper edge, "the Worthington Endowment Trust is a restricted account. If you're attempting to fraudulently access funds that don't belong to you, that's a federal crime." Arthur looked at her in confusion. "I don't know anything about an endowment trust. I'm just trying to get money from my disability pension. There must be some mistake." But Ms. Davis was no longer listening. The possibility that she was dealing with an attempted fraud on one of the bank's most important accounts had triggered every alarm in her corporate-trained mind. She immediately reached for her phone and dialed a number that connected directly to the executive offices. "Mr. Sterling's office. This is Patricia Davis at the downtown branch. We have a situation involving the Worthington Endowment Trust that requires immediate attention." "Yes, sir. I understand. We'll secure the situation until you arrive." Arthur watched this exchange with growing bewilderment. He had come to the bank for a simple transaction that he had performed dozens of times before, but somehow the situation had escalated into accusations of fraud and calls to corporate executives. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Arthur said, his voice remaining calm despite the chaos swirling around him. "I've been banking here for 15 years. I just need to withdraw money for my rent and groceries." Ms. Davis ignored his explanation instead, focusing on damage control. She instructed Brad to secure all of Arthur's documentation and began making additional calls to bank security. The lobby, which had been quietly efficient moments before, was now buzzing with tension and whispered conversations. Other customers began to take notice of the commotion, some pulling out their phones to record what appeared to be the apprehension of a suspected criminal. Arthur found himself at the center of a growing spectacle, his quiet dignity under assault from all sides. "Sir, you'll need to remain here until this matter is resolved," Ms. Davis informed him. "We've contacted the appropriate authorities, and someone will be here shortly to address this situation." Arthur nodded quietly, understanding that he had somehow stumbled into something far beyond his comprehension. He thought about leaving, simply walking away from this humiliation and finding another bank, but his practical nature told him that running would only make things worse. As he stood waiting in the marble lobby, surrounded by whispers and stares, Arthur reflected on the irony of his situation. He had spent his life serving others, protecting his country, and trying to live with honor and dignity. Yet here he was, being treated like a common criminal, because his war-damaged hands couldn't produce a signature that met the standards of a bank teller barely out of high school. The crisis reached its peak when the bank's front doors opened with a force that seemed to shake the entire building. Two men in dark suits entered first, their movements precise and professional as they scanned the lobby with the practiced eyes of security specialists. Their presence immediately commanded attention, and conversations throughout the bank fell to whispers. Behind them walked a man whose very bearing announced his importance before anyone could read his nameplate or recognize his face. William Sterling, CEO of First National Bank Corporation, moved through the lobby with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his dark suit impeccably tailored, and his expression carried the weight of absolute authority. The effect on the bank staff was immediate and dramatic. Ms. Davis, who had been managing the situation with corporate efficiency, suddenly looked pale and uncertain. Brad, who had been enjoying his moment of perceived authority over Arthur, now appeared to shrink behind his teller window. "Where is the individual involved in the Worthington endowment situation?" Mr. Sterling asked, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent lobby. Ms. Davis hurried forward, her earlier confidence replaced by nervous deference. "Mr. Sterling, sir, thank you for coming so quickly. The individual is right here," she said, gesturing toward Arthur, who stood quietly near the teller windows, still clutching his worn satchel. Mr. Sterling's eyes found Arthur, and something remarkable happened. The stern, authoritative expression that had marked his entrance softened into something approaching concern, then recognition, then what could only be described as profound respect. "Arthur," Mr. Sterling said quietly, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised everyone in the lobby. "Arthur Hayes." Arthur looked up, his faded blue eyes meeting the CEO's gaze with quiet dignity. "Yes, sir. I'm Arthur Hayes." Mr. Sterling moved toward Arthur with quick, purposeful steps, ignoring Ms. Davis and Brad entirely. When he reached the elderly veteran, he extended his hand with genuine warmth. "Captain Hayes," Mr. Sterling said, his voice filled with emotion that surprised everyone present. "It's an honor to meet you, sir." Brad, unable to contain himself, stepped forward with misplaced confidence. "Mr. Sterling, this man was attempting to fraudulently access the Worthington Endowment Trust. His signature is illegible, and he claims to be Mr." Sterling's head turned toward Brad with a look so cold that the young teller's words died in his throat. "You will not speak?" the CEO said quietly, his voice carrying a menace that made Brad step backward. Turning back to Arthur, Mr. Sterling's expression returned to one of respect and concern. "Captain Hayes, I apologize profoundly for how you've been treated here today. There has been a terrible misunderstanding." Arthur looked confused. "Sir, I think there's been some mistake. I'm not a captain anymore. I'm just trying to withdraw money from my pension account." Mr. Sterling's eyes blazed as he turned to address the entire lobby, his voice carrying to every corner of the bank. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to understand exactly who this man is. This is Captain Arthur Hayes, United States Marine Corps recipient of the Silver Star, Bronze Star, and Purple Heart. He is also the great-grandson of Jonathan Worthington, the founder of this bank." The revelation hit the lobby like a thunderbolt. Customers and staff alike stared in shock as Mr. Sterling continued. "The Worthington Endowment Trust was established by Captain Hayes's family and was rescued from insolvency 30 years ago by Captain Hayes himself, who donated his entire inheritance to keep this bank solvent during the savings and loan crisis. Ms. Davis looked as though she might faint. Brad's face had gone completely white as the magnitude of his mistake became clear. Mr. Sterling picked up Arthur's withdrawal slip and examined the shaky signature with reverence rather than disdain. "This signature," he said, his voice rising with controlled anger, "is not the mark of age or incompetence. It is the mark of courage written by hands that were shattered defending our freedom in the jungles of Vietnam." The CEO's gaze swept across the assembled bank staff with withering intensity. Captain Hayes came here today to withdraw money from his modest pension account, money he earned through his service to our country. Instead, he was mocked, humiliated, and accused of fraud by employees who lack the basic decency to treat a war hero with respect. The crisis had been completely transformed. What had begun as an accusation of fraud had been revealed as a profound failure of character and judgment by the bank's own staff. The silence in the bank lobby was so complete that the sound of Mr. Sterling's breathing seemed amplified as he continued to hold Arthur's withdrawal slip, his eyes moving between the shaky signature and the faces of his employees who had so catastrophically failed in their duties. "Captain Hayes," Mr. Sterling said, his voice gentle but carrying clearly throughout the lobby, "you came here today to withdraw money for your basic needs, rent, groceries, the simple necessities of life. Instead, you were subjected to mockery and accusations by people who should have been honored to serve you." Arthur shifted uncomfortably under the attention, his natural humility making him uneasy with the public recognition. "Sir, I don't need any special treatment. I just wanted to get my money and go home." "But you do deserve special treatment," Mr. Sterling replied firmly. "Not because of your family's connection to this bank, but because of your service to our country and the dignity with which you've conducted yourself throughout this ordeal." The CEO turned to face Brad, who was now visibly trembling behind his teller window. "You," Mr. Sterling said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "mocked a war hero's signature. You laughed at hands that were damaged while defending your freedom. You treated a founder's descendant like a common criminal." Brad opened his mouth to speak, but Mr. Sterling raised a hand to silence him. "You are terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." The swift justice was shocking in its finality. Brad, who had been so confident in his authority just minutes before, now faced the complete destruction of his employment and reputation. Ms. Davis, understanding that her own career was in jeopardy, stepped forward with desperate professionalism. "Mr. Sterling, I take full responsibility for this situation. I should have investigated more thoroughly before making accusations." Mr. Sterling's gaze shifted to her with slightly less venom, but no less disappointment. "Ms. Davis, you will undergo immediate retraining in customer service, veteran affairs, and basic human decency. You will also personally oversee the implementation of new protocols to ensure this never happens again." The climactic moment came when Mr. Sterling turned back to Arthur and made an announcement that would transform not just the immediate situation, but the entire culture of the bank. "Captain Hayes," Mr. Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of corporate authority and personal conviction, "I am personally taking charge of your account. You will never again face questions about your signature, your identity, or your right to access your own money. Mr. Sterling gestured to one of his security escorts, who immediately produced a leather portfolio. Furthermore, the bank is making an immediate contribution of $1 million to the Worthington Endowment Trust in your honor, and we are establishing a new fund to provide assistance to veterans who face similar challenges. Arthur looked stunned by the announcement. "Sir, that's very generous, but I don't need—" "It's not about what you need," Mr. Sterling interrupted gently. "It's about what's right. This bank was built on principles of service and respect, principles that you embody and that my employees forgot today." The CEO then made an announcement that sent ripples of shock through the assembled crowd. Effective immediately, First National Bank is implementing the Captain Arthur Hayes Protocol. Any veteran who faces challenges with banking services due to service-related disabilities will receive immediate assistance and accommodation. Mr. Sterling's voice grew stronger as he outlined the changes. "We will be partnering with veteran organizations to train our staff, establishing dedicated service representatives for veteran customers, and creating a fund to provide emergency financial assistance to veterans in need." The transformation in the lobby was palpable. Customers who had been recording the confrontation with their phones were now witnessing something unprecedented: a corporate leader taking immediate, meaningful action to address a systemic failure. Arthur, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of his circumstances, struggled to find words. "Mr. Sterling, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll allow us to make this right," Mr. Sterling replied. "Say you'll give us the chance to honor your service the way we should have from the beginning." The climactic revelation came when Mr. Sterling shared information that even Arthur didn't fully understand. Captain Hayes, your great-grandfather Jonathan Worthington, didn't just found this bank. He established it specifically to serve veterans returning from World War I. Your family's vision was that this institution would always be a place where those who served our country would find respect and support. Arthur's eyes widened as he learned about his family's legacy. "I never knew. My father never talked much about the family history." "The Worthington Endowment Trust wasn't just a family fund," Mr. Sterling continued. "It was designed to ensure that this bank would always honor its commitment to veterans. When you donated your inheritance to save the bank 30 years ago, you weren't just preserving a financial institution, you were preserving your great-grandfather's vision." The climax reached its peak when Mr. Sterling made a personal commitment that went beyond corporate policy. "Captain Hayes, I want you to know that you have my personal phone number. If you ever face any difficulty at any of our branches, you call me directly." As the immediate crisis resolved, the broader implications became clear. Arthur Hayes, who had entered the bank as a dismissed and humiliated pensioner, was leaving as a recognized hero, whose treatment had exposed and corrected a fundamental failure in the institution's values. The climax had transformed a moment of corporate cruelty into a powerful demonstration of accountability, justice, and the importance of honoring those who have served their country with distinction. 6 months after the incident at First National Bank, the ripple effects of Arthur Hayes' treatment had transformed not just the institution, but the broader conversation about how veterans are treated in civilian society. The Captain Arthur Hayes Protocol had been implemented across all 847 branches of First National Bank Corporation, creating a new standard for veteran customer service that other financial institutions began to adopt. Arthur himself had experienced a profound change in his daily life. The $1 million contribution to the Worthington Endowment Trust had been used to establish a comprehensive veteran assistance program that provided everything from emergency financial aid to job placement services. Arthur, despite his initial reluctance, had agreed to serve as the program's honorary director, giving him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his military service. Every morning when I wake up, Arthur would tell visitors to the program's offices, I think about how one moment of cruelty became an opportunity to help thousands of veterans. Sometimes the worst experiences lead to the best outcomes. Brad Morrison's termination had become a cautionary tale used in customer service training programs across the banking industry. His treatment of Arthur had been documented and studied as an example of how unconscious bias and lack of empathy could destroy both careers and institutional reputations. Ms. Davis had undergone extensive retraining and had become one of the bank's most effective advocates for veteran customers. Her experience with Arthur had fundamentally changed her understanding of service and sacrifice, leading her to pursue additional education in veteran affairs and trauma-informed customer service. Mr. Sterling had kept his personal commitment to Arthur, and the two men had developed an unlikely friendship that bridged their different backgrounds and experiences. The CEO regularly visited Arthur at the Veteran Assistance Program offices, and their conversations had influenced policy changes throughout the corporation. Most significantly, Arthur's story had inspired legislation in several states requiring sensitivity training for employees who serve veteran populations. The Worthington Act mandated that financial institutions receiving federal deposits must provide accommodations for customers with service-related disabilities. The real victory, Arthur would reflect during interviews about his experience, isn't what happened to me personally. It's that other veterans won't have to face the humiliation I faced. If my shaky signature helped create a more respectful world for my fellow veterans, then it was worth every moment of embarrassment. The disabled veteran who had been laughed at for his signature had become a symbol of dignity, perseverance, and the power of institutional accountability to create positive change. This story demonstrates how individual acts of disrespect toward veterans can be transformed into opportunities for systemic change when leaders choose accountability over defensiveness and action over apology.